Welcome to Saipan. It's hard to imagine, but these beautiful beaches were once the site of one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific during World War II. On June 15, 1944, a massive American invasion fleet consisting of 15 battleships, 15 aircraft carriers, and a flotilla of support vessels filled with 71,000 troops were preparing to land on these beaches near the city of Kanoa. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were all islands in the Marianas that the Americans intended to use as advanced naval and air bases in the war against Japan. B-29 bombers based out of Saipan would finally be able to achieve the goal of striking at the Japanese homeland from the air. The Japanese were heavily entrenched on the island, with Japanese Emperor Hirohito telling his troops, "If Saipan is lost, air raids on Tokyo will take place often. Therefore, you absolutely must hold Saipan." I'm Joshua Hanlon, and today we'll be taking you around the island of Saipan to key sites from the battle that took place here in 1944. The Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions preparing to land that morning in June were heading into the face of 32,000 Japanese defenders, more than double what they expected to encounter going into the landing. As the Marines approached the shore of Saipan's southwest coast, Japanese shells began falling on the American Amtrak landing crafts before they even reached the shoreline. Heavy American bombardment of the island in the days leading up to the landing, including more than 2,400 massive 16-inch shells from the battleships, proved unable to destroy heavily entrenched Japanese defenders. Due to Japanese bombardment and crater-filled beaches, the Amtraks had to unload the Marines much earlier than expected, leaving them vulnerable on the beach as they began 3 weeks of bloody fighting. To make matters worse, the 2nd Marine Division landed too far north, leaving a gap between the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions on the island that had to be closed through hard fighting. By nightfall, on the first day of combat, 20,000 men were dug in on the beach, enough to repulse 3 large Japanese counterattacks. Evidence of the hard-fought beach landings can still be seen in the waters around Saipan today. 3 Sherman tanks sit lifeless in the shallow waters leading up to the landing beaches. If you'd like to learn more about these tanks, as well as see underwater footage of them, look for a link in the description where we made a more in-depth video on just these 3 tanks. Near Kanoa, on the beach just a few feet from the waterline, is a great example of a large Japanese bunker from the war. The Japanese were dug into positions like this all over the island to help repulse any invading force. You can see it shows a lot of wear and tear from the years since the war, as well as any damage it took during the battle for Saipan. The thickness of the concrete on some of these Japanese bunkers is incredible. They were able to withstand massive explosions due to how reinforced and thick the concrete was, and you can see here that it's layer after layer to try to keep the troops safe inside. Between Beach Road and the ocean is a Type 97 Japanese tank on top of an old Japanese bunker here on Saipan. On June 16th, the day after the initial American invasion, the Japanese counterattacked with the largest tank battle of the Pacific War. 44 Japanese tanks with infantry attacked the Americans here on what was known as Red Beach to try to push them back into the sea. The attack failed, and you can see one of the tanks that was left here since the war. There are a number of examples of Type 97 tanks like this, as well as Type 95 Japanese light tanks scattered throughout Saipan. Inside here you can see the engine is still left, as well as parts of the tracks and wheels on the outside. These tanks had interesting turret design because you had the main gun on one side here, and then if you come around to the other side, there was actually a spot for a machine gun in the back of the turret. So if needed, the commander could turn the turret around and have multiple machine guns facing forward. Here on the placard is a great quote from Major James Donovan, who said that the Japanese counterattack evolved itself into a madhouse of noise, tracers, and flashing lights. As tanks were hit and set afire, they silhouetted other tanks coming out of the flickering shadows. 2 days fighting on this beachhead cost the U.S. 2nd Marine Division 3,500 casualties in the opening days of the battle for Saipan. Moving from the southwest coast to the northern and southern tips of the island, the Marines, joined by the Army's 27th Infantry Division, began pushing back the Japanese. Within 5 days, the airfield where I'm standing now was captured and the gap between the two Marine divisions was closed. The Aslito airfield was a key objective for the Americans because it would allow them to start flying planes out of Saipan, so the Japanese heavily defended it with bunkers like the one behind me here that is half buried in the hill today and survives just outside of the entrance to the airport here on Saipan. There are a number of memorials to the Japanese defenders of Saipan here around the airport. This one to my right is for the 3rd Battalion of the 89th Infantry, who fought to the last man here defending the airport. Many of these memorials speak of the artillery regiments or infantry battalions, whatever it might be, defending to the last man in the effort to push back the Americans. As the Americans advanced north from Kanoa behind me, they began to encounter the geographic obstacles that made Saipan so difficult to overcome. The 2nd Marine Division was tasked with taking Saipan's highest peak, Mount Tapachu, where I'm standing now. 10 days after the beach landings, the mountain was conquered by Marines after fierce fighting. Once the mountain was taken, the Americans had the line of sight advantage and were able to continue their push north. While the Marines were taking the mountain, the 27th Infantry Division was forcing its way through a valley with high fortified cliffs on each side that soon came to be known to the soldiers as Death Valley. The American offensive was quickly proving to be too much for the Japanese defenders to handle. By the end of June, the 27th Division was through Death Valley, and by July 5th, all the major towns and airfields were controlled by the Americans. We made our way now to the last Japanese command post. This area has a large cave behind me, which is where the command post was located, as well as a number of examples of small and large artillery pieces and tanks and various other weapons from the battle in the skies, on land, and in the water around Saipan. Now we're inside of the last Japanese command post, and as you can see from the destruction in all of the walls around me, this area took a hard beating during the fighting in the north of Saipan. There are large marks in basically all of the surrounding walls here as the Japanese held out at the end of the battle. On July 6th, Japanese Lieutenant General Saito issued a farewell message calling on his troops to fight to the death. On the morning of June 7th, over 3,000 Japanese troops gathered for the greatest banzai attack of the war in a last-effort suicide attack that was stopped after more intense fighting. The charge tore through the troops on the front lines and made its way down the coast to the Marine artillery batteries. Technical Sergeant Frederick Stiltz recalled, "When they hit us, there were so many of them we couldn't shoot fast enough. We were shooting them at 15 or 20 yards. Artillery was breaking them up, but some of the artillery fell short and hit among us. We must have killed 300 or 400 Japs. They were piled around us." The final casualty list showed 97% of the Japanese defenders, totaling more than 30,000 troops, died while defending the island. The Americans suffered 14,000 casualties and deaths taking Saipan. However, the death didn't end with the final Japanese charge. Due to Japanese propaganda telling the local civilians on Saipan that the Americans would rape and torture them if they were captured, 2/3 of the 12,000 non-combatants chose suicide in the final days of the battle on places like Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff behind me. With nowhere else to go, people started hurling themselves into the sea from the cliffs on the north of the island. A patrol craft commander in the water below Banzai Cliff later reported the progress of his boat was slow and tedious because of the hundreds of corpses floating in the water. Civilians who were reluctant to die were encouraged to commit suicide by Japanese soldiers who believed suicide was preferable to surrender. When a man and woman with 4 children hesitated to jump at the edge of a cliff, a Japanese sniper here on Marpy Point nearby made their decision for them by killing the man and then the woman. A Japanese woman ran to the cliff edge and carried the children to safety. The sniper then walked out of his cave and fell in a storm of American bullets. American soldiers didn't know how to respond to such a foreign military ideology. They were sometimes baffled, but more often enraged by the Japanese approach to warfare. Marine General Alexander Vandergrift wrote, "I have never heard or read of this kind of fighting. These people refuse to surrender. The wounded wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves up and other fellows to pieces with a hand grenade." Historian John Lynn has observed that on Saipan, Americans faced death to achieve military victory, while the Japanese chose death to elevate physical defeat into moral triumph. Lynn further notes, it was as if Americans and Japanese were more than enemies, but rather entirely different species. Japanese soldiers were willing to live out the code of conduct their ideology demanded. Surrender was unacceptable, and the 1941 Field Service Guide clearly stated, "Do not be taken prisoner alive." In the final days of the battle for Saipan, Lieutenant General Saito, Major General Igita, and Vice Admiral Nagumo all committed ritual suicide. One of the many memorials at the top of Banzai Cliff is a poem inscribed here that the Japanese emperor wrote in 2005 when he visited the island. He wrote, "Down below this cliff, multitudinous the lives that people lost here, where the ocean is so deep and the seas are blue and clear." Japanese military ideology during World War II helps explain why the battle for Saipan was such a bloody conflict. However, that bloodshed became a turning point in the war against Japan. Lieutenant General Holland Smith stated after the war, "I have always considered Saipan the decisive battle of the Pacific, for it breached Japan's inner defense line and opened the way to the home islands."